So in the near future, I'm going to start releasing episodes about some of my NOPI events, NDRA, NOPI Drift, all that kind of stuff. And for you younger folks, when I say the words NOPI, you think of drag racing, car shows, bikini girls, maybe NOPI tuner vision, drifting. And that's what NOPI is known as now, but I want to talk a little bit about the background and the history of the company itself before we get into the shows and whatnot. So the first thing we need to know is that NOPI stands for Number One Parts Incorporated. NOPI was a parts sales organization. A gentleman by the name of William Myers founded NOPI in 1966. And to put that in perspective, I'm 45 years old, and in 1966, my dad was a brand new private in the United States Army, getting trained up to ship out for Vietnam. So NOPI's been selling parts for a long, long time. They started out as a Volkswagen, Porsche, Audi parts supplier. They're in the metro Atlanta area. And of course they grew and they grew and they grew, and companies do that. They grow. At some point, Mr. Myers' sons, Mark and Michael, got involved, and actually Michael's the elder and Mark was the younger. They got involved, and in 1988, they had their first NOPI bug off in Atlanta, or Marietta, I guess. And that event was successful, and then they had Bug Off 2 in 89 and Bug Off 3 and Bug Off 4. And then they started adding the trucks and the imports around 1992. And they changed venues because they got too big for the old venues. So they moved from Marietta, and I think the original Bug Off may have been at one of their stores actually, but they moved to Marietta. They moved from Marietta to the Lakewood Fairgrounds in Atlanta, and they were there for many years. And it became, NOPI Bug Off Truck and Import Show, and then it was NOPI Custom and Classic Truck and Car Show. And then in 1994, it became NOPI Nationals. And again, it grew and grew and grew. 1997, I guess, they started the import drag racing. And that's not quite where I got involved, because I was just finishing up college in 1997. But my first exposure to NOPI was 1998 or 99. After I finished college, I bought a Nissan 240SX. And NOPI was one of the few places that carried parts for the 240, because in those days, that was before the drifting craze had come along. In 1998, 1999, if you owned a 240SX, you were like me. You were an autocrosser, or you were looking to do an engine swap. And engine swaps weren't exactly ubiquitous at that point. Most people in the scene, in the sort of the import scene, were doing the Honda thing, because Honda had a lot of engines that they could swap around. You could put a big engine in a Civic, you could put a Prelude engine in an Integra. There were just a lot of ways that you could mix and match Honda components that Nissans weren't necessarily doing yet. But I bought a strut tower brace and installed it on my 240, and that was my first dealings with NOPI. And that was the days where you were still called the 800 number, and talk to a live human being, and they would figure out the part that you wanted and tell you how much it cost, and you give them your credit card number and your address, and then the UPS truck would bring it. Because even though internet existed in 1998, we were still basically on dial-up, so these big e-commerce setups were not the thing yet. Fast forward to around 2004, and that's when I got involved in NOPI for real, because that's when I attended my first event. So 2004, I attended the NOPI Xbox Race Wars in Virginia at Dinwiddie, Virginia Motorsports Park, so just outside of Richmond. And that was sort of my first real NOPI event, and it was the events at that point were not what they are or what they came to be. There was some drag racing. There was some car shows, some stereo competitions. There were some girls there, but they were not the sort of prim and proper, made-for-TV NOPI chicks that you came to see later. These were a lot of local girls that moonlighted at Hooters or wherever, and they were just sort of there to have fun and be on stage. And there was musical acts, and it was a good scene, but it was very different from what the later shows were. So I did Virginia in 2004. I went back to Dinwiddie in 2005, and this time it was the Xbox Cup. And that was a 2-day event again, and I went to that, and that was, again, I had a good time, and it was a little more advanced than the year before, but still not the big, huge mega shows that we were used to seeing. And in those days, they still had the Super Street Tour. So Peterson Magazine, Super Street Magazine, which was an import-focused magazine, they sponsored this tour where these kids would roll down the highway to the NOPI Nationals in Atlanta. So you had one segment that would start in like Baltimore and work its way south. You had another group that would start in maybe Dallas, and they would work their way east across the country. And then you had a third group that would start from Miami and work their way north. And this was covered in their magazine. So if you can imagine, Peterson Publishing at that time had, 4 or 5 magazines that were focused specifically on foreign cars, and then they had another couple that did trucks or mini trucks or whatever. So you had a European tuner magazine, you had a import tuner magazine, you had another import magazine. Just, they had a lot of books, and they gave a lot of attention to the Super Street Tour and the NOPI Nationals, because the NOPI Nationals was a super show that wasn't just import car specific. You had trucks, you had bikes, you had Volkswagens, you had basically something for everybody there. So each magazine covered the event from their angle, for their particular market, and it really grew. It got enormous. There was a point there in the late 90s and the early 2000s, you couldn't open an import car magazine or a compact car, depending on what you want to call it. You couldn't open one of those magazines and not see a 4, 5, or 6 page NOPI spread plus their racing schedule in the magazine. So 2005, they actually came to my home state of North Carolina, and for reasons I don't remember, I wasn't there. You gotta remember, this is 15 years ago, and I don't remember. We didn't have daily blogging on Facebook back then, so I don't know what I was doing. But whatever the case was, that event was on my calendar, but I didn't go, and I couldn't tell you why. My best guess is that in 2005, I was in the process of rebuilding my car, and also I was job hunting. So I was looking for a new job, and actually July of that year, I actually relocated from North Carolina out to the Midwest. So 2005 was sort of a wasted year for me. I did do a couple of events. I did the one NOPI event in Virginia, but I didn't do the one that was an hour from my house. And my guess is that I had a family obligation or was otherwise indisposed. But 2006, since I had moved to the Midwest, I sort of did the double dip in 2006. So June 3rd and 4th of 2006 was the Xbox Cup at Gateway International Raceway, which is in East St. Louis metro area. Gateway is actually across the river in Illinois, but for branding purposes, it was the St. Louis event. So I did that on June 3rd and 4th. And then I flew home to North Carolina for the 4th of July weekend and stayed the full week. And I did July 8th and 9th at Rockingham. So I did like 2 NOPI events back to back there. And that was a lot of fun. And Even though they're the same event, they're different really because you have different local racers show up. You have different girls, different. Each show has its own flavor because it's set up at Gateway, which is a NASCAR oval with a drag strip. You had a lot more space, and it was a larger metro area, so you had kids from Chicago and kids from St. Louis, and I think people probably even came from as far away as Kansas City. So you had this huge show, whereas Rockingham, that's a rural part of North Carolina, and it's a drag strip, so you don't have as much space. And I'm trying to think, I figure you probably have some kids from Charlotte, you'd have kids from Raleigh, but Rockingham itself is the country, so the population in that part of North Carolina is not very dense. So these people were coming from up and down the highway, really. So that was 2006. So 2007, I did the Miami event, Greater Miami Regional Area, I guess you could call it. I did St. Louis in June, and I was all set for them to come to Chicago, which was only a couple hours from my house. It was actually closer than St. Louis. And that event was canceled. With about a week to go, actually. The August NOPI Drift event at Toyota Stadium, which is the soccer stadium in Chicago, was canceled. NOPI started sending out press releases to all the, sort of all the message boards, chat boards. Basically, it said, NOPI Motorsports is sad to announce the cancellation of the NOPI Drift event in Chicago this weekend, August 18th and 19th. NOPI has received notification this morning from Toyota Park that they will not make the facility available for NOPI for the Drift event in Chicago this weekend. NOPI believes that it has a valid contract with Anschutz Chicago Stadium LLC, the owner of the facility, and the reasons for their refusal to allow the event to take place are still not clear. NOPI has instructed its attorney to take any and all action necessary to hold them accountable for their actions in refusing to honor their contract with NOPI. We have been negotiating with Toyota Park since last October, and they have even been selling tickets on their website. People from all over the country were scheduled to come to this event, and we have invested tens of thousands of dollars in upfront costs, stated Michael Myers, president of NOPI Motorsports LLC. T. Michael Martin, attorney for NOPI Motorsports, stated, "We believe that we clearly have a valid agreement with the facility, and their refusal to allow this event is a breach of that agreement, and we will hold them accountable for their actions. NOPI will suffer serious financial losses because of this action, and we take any and all necessary actions, including the filing of a lawsuit, to recoup those losses and the damage done to the reputation of NOPI Motorsports LLC," Martin continued. "We believe that this refusal to allow the event may well be political and has nothing to do with the terms of the agreement entered into." Just like that, the NOPI Drift event in Chicago went away. So that pretty much ended my 2007. I did one more HPDE event that fall, that October, and then I packed my car away for the winter and started, I was supposed to be upgrading it to get ready for 2008, and that didn't quite go off the way I had planned, but that's a whole nother thing. 2008 comes around, and I'm down basically because I've got to spend, I didn't count on Midwestern winters. In North Carolina, I was used to working on my car November, December, January, February. Basically, as long as you had an enclosed garage, you were good to go. It didn't get, ridiculously cold where you couldn't work on a car. In Illinois, it gets cold enough that you don't want to touch the tools because the tools themselves in the toolbox are below freezing. That's not fun. You can't work on a car when it's that cold. So I lost my winter refit period while I was in the Midwest. So spring 2008, and spring comes late in that part of Illinois that I lived in. It is normally still below freezing well into March. So you got basically April, May is when you really start getting outdoors and doing stuff. So you get a late start on working on your car. And I didn't have much of a 2008. But the other thing that happened in 2008 was NOPI itself basically pulled the plug on their events. And I don't know the whole story because I wasn't there. But basically NOPI Motorsports canceled. And I'll read the whole press release. Okay, here we go. July 17th, 2008, 9:32 a.m. For 20 years, a mass of automotive enthusiasts has descended upon Atlanta Motor Speedway for the NOPI Nationals Motorsport Super Show. NOPI, a Georgia-based aftermarket parts and accessories dealer, built a loyal following with their national super show, attracting upwards of 90,000 attendees each year. Through the success of their car and truck shows, the company also took on the task of running a nationwide drag race and drifting series. But this year, NOPI won't be filling the Atlanta Speedway's infield for the 21st year this September, as the Nationals Motorsports Super Show has been canceled. In fact, all remaining 2008 NOPI events, from car shows to drag racing and drifting, have been called off. According to NOPI, the rationale behind the decision is due to tough times currently being endured by the automotive industry. With vehicle sales in the dumpster, one can only imagine that accessory purchases are also being cut from most consumers' budgets. Compounded with the rising fuel prices and reduced event attendance, finishing out the schedule did not make economic sense for NOPI. It is sad to hear of such a staple event forced to shutter. Hopefully, NOPI can weather the storm and bring back the debauchery another season. That was from an auto blog. So this is from Auto Week's website. NOPI Motorsports, which has hosted import drags, drifting competitions, and car shows, has canceled the rest of its 2008 season, citing an organizational restructuring in light of severe adverse effects of the disappointing spring season. The economy and unfavorable weather resulted in underperformance of all spring events, NOPI said in a statement. Michael Myers, president of NOPI Motorsports, reports that NOPI Motorsports is working with its clients and sponsors to minimize the uncertainty going forward. This is a reflection of the economic times in which we currently live. The NHRA, which sanctions the drag events, was officially disappointed. NHRA is surprised and extremely disappointed to hear that NOPI Motorsports has announced that it plans to cancel the rest of the 2008 NOPI Drag Racing Season Series. Its statement read, NHRA encourages racers to participate in its Lucas Oil Drag Racing Series and the Summit Racing Series, as well as reminding racers that Battle of the Imports has 4 NHRA member tracks remaining on its 2008 season schedule, with events planned for Sacramento, Fontana, Portland, and Seattle. So yeah, basically everybody was throwing shade at NOPI, and that really wasn't the end of NOPI. It seemed like it was going to be, but they came roaring back. So NOPI came back with a series of partnership events with Redline Time Attack and Hot Import Nights. So basically a series of co-branded events in 2009 and 2010. And by that point, I was no longer really in the scene, but some weird things started happening, or what I call weird. NOPI sort of shifted. They became, whereas NOPI was a brand that sold parts. To me, they were a store, and they had this other thing that they did on the side that was branded with their name because it was a good way to hype their company and sell parts. And then all of a sudden, it became that NOPI was sort of just a car show company. But they continued on through 2013, 2014, and then in 2015, the younger of the two sons died. He died in July 2015, I guess. And I'm sure, for a family-run company, it was the father and it was the two sons. And the sons, Mike and Mark, ran the motorsports side of the business. I think the dad ran the parts selling side of the business. And so that hurt. That was a hit. And they actually canceled a couple events late in 2015 after he died. But they moved to Myrtle Beach and they started doing Spring Break Nationals at Myrtle Beach, NOPI Nationals, which was different. But then in 2018, the elder son died. And, I don't know all the particulars and details because I'm just getting what I could pick up off the web. And it was pretty easy to find their obituaries, but basically it says, Michael William Myers, 56, of Atlanta, Georgia, passed away Monday, December 24th, 2018. He was preceded in death by his brother Mark. He was survived by his father and mother. You know, Mr. Myers was employed by Number One Parts Incorporated for more than 20 years. During that time, he managed the NOPI store on Clay Street in Marietta. He went on to become the manager of 10 branches of NOPI stores. A little later, Mr. Myers was the promoter of NOPI Nationals Car Show. And, it goes on with his funeral details. So, more recently, I ran into a YouTube video from that same year that basically said that NOPI was going to close down, that their parts distribution guy, their number one guy, was going to hang up his boots and retire, and that was that. What's interesting, though, is that NOPI still has their business license is still current with the state of Georgia, even though that their old headquarters down in Forest Park has been sold. I thought that was interesting, but yeah, their business license with Georgia is still active, and it was registered for 2020. So technically, they're still in business, but I did note that their headquarters has been moved from where it used to be in Georgia to elsewhere, and I'm not going to give their address, but it's not the 486 Main Street address in Forest Park that it used to be. They sold that location. And the Myrtle Beach the NOPI Nationals that were at Myrtle Beach, according to their website this year, they are officially branded as the Myrtle Beach Nationals, formerly NOPI Nationals. And even though we're in the midst of this coronavirus thing, as of a few days ago, their website said they were still holding the event. Let me read the exact quote. Coronavirus update for Myrtle Beach Nationals. The show is on. Myrtle Beach Nationals is a go for March 27th through 29th. The safety, health, and wellness of our guests is always the number one priority. We want you to feel confident and comfortable when visiting our outdoor, emphasis on outdoor, speedway, as enhanced sanitation stations are in place. We ask that all our guests practice social distancing, and please do not attend if you have flu-like symptoms. Register your cars and buy tickets here online. So the former NOPI National Myrtle Beach show is apparently still on what used to be called the Spring Break Nationals. And I don't know if NOPI's involved with it, but NOPI's business registration still exists. So I guess somewhere out there is something called NOPI. I don't know what they're doing. Their old website is gone. They certainly don't have their old e-catalog that they used to have. So I don't know what the deal is. I assume the old man is in semi-retirement and collecting his money, and maybe somebody is responsible for putting the NOPI brand on certain things, but they couldn't work it out with Myrtle Beach. I don't know all the details on that, so we'll take that as speculation on my part. So here's what I'll say about NOPI overall. A lot of people had a lot of things to say about their cancellations in 2008. But, and I'm not an event planner. I have scheduled some small events for a couple of nonprofits that I'm members of, literally like the fundraiser scholarship dinner for 300 people. I've done some events like that. I've done a small conference for 200 members of a social organization I belong to, so sort of like a 2-day. So I've worked with a convention center hotel to book, event space and block hotel rooms and some of those things. And I know a lot of times there are contractual obligations that go with that, even if the event doesn't fly. So if you can imagine, if you're a company like NOPI, and depending on what sources you read, they were making between 2.5 to 15 million in revenue. And full disclosure, NOPI was a privately held company, and so they don't have to release a public report to the SEC. So it's very difficult to find out how much money they were actually making. But 2.5 to 15 million is not a huge company as things go in this country. So you have a couple of shows scheduled. You got a series of drag events scheduled. A couple of them get rained out, or there's a tornado or whatever, act of God kind of stuff. You may or may not have insurance that covers that, that will cover your losses on those events, but you still had cash outlays up front. So even if you've got insurance to pay off those vendors, you still don't have that income. You don't have that profit coming in from those events. So as you get later and later in the year and you see, okay, we've had some bad weather and we've had some low turnout, we're not making enough money to keep this going. A smart businessman knows when to cut his losses and get out. And I think that's what they did in 2008 because, again, they're a privately held company. They were a small family company. They weren't some huge conglomerate that could absorb a lot of losses and bounce back the next year. They saw the writing on the wall, and by 2008, I hate to say it this way, but eBay and a lot of these other companies were eating their lunch because NOPI, when they first got into the import market, NOPI had pretty much, I don't want to say a monopoly on the East Coast, but they basically had a monopoly on the East Coast because they had relationships with vendors where a lot of other distributors who weren't in that market yet and private people like us couldn't just get on the web and order parts. So you kind of had to use NOPI. And I think like a lot of mail order or what I call catalog companies, 800 number companies. And remember, NOPI was a brick and mortar before it was even a mail order company. So you have this brick and mortar entity with a number of employees. And then you had their mail order web division. But as everybody else started getting into e-commerce, your Amazons and your eBays and all these companies in Japan suddenly had multiple distributors across the U.S., NOPI was no longer the sole provider of these parts. And in the face of that competition, they started losing business. They may have overexpanded, and then they may have extended themselves a little too far with the car shows because those are risky businesses. You have a lot of upfront outlays, and you're relying on spectators and competitors to show up and pay money day of the event. Yeah, some people pay ahead of time, but a lot of people buy their tickets at the gate because you don't know if it's going to rain. You don't drag race in the rain. So you have these upfront outlays, and then you're relying on spectators and racers to show up and pay their money at the gate for you to recoup your money and push yourself into the profit. And if you don't have those events, you don't generate any profits. So I can sort of see, again, I'm speculating, I don't know, but just what I know about business and what I know about event planning, I could see where if you have a couple of bad events early in the year, you don't have the funds, you don't have the cash reserves to hold the later events, and it's better to pull out early than risk losing more money. So I get that. They came back in 2009, 2010 with these partnerships where they had less on the line. Probably they had some financial interest, but mostly they were lending their name because if you say, hey, it's Redline Time Attack and NOPI, that's going to draw a bigger crowd. If you say, hey, it's Hot Import Nights and NOPI, that's going to draw a bigger crowd. Moving the show, the Nationals, from Atlanta to Myrtle Beach, and having this thing where they had a string of, NOPI National shows instead of just the drag drift show events and then the Nationals in Atlanta, I think you could see where they were trying to change the business model and keep up with the times. But with what we had, with what happened with the economy in 2008, 2009, 2010, those were some pretty tough years for a lot of folks. I imagine a lot of people just didn't want to spend a lot of money, and they weren't, the events weren't hitting. Then you get into the late 2010s, the 15, 16, 17 era. You had Mark, who was very involved in the show production side of the business. He died. And then 2 years later, his older brother dies, and Dad probably just says, the hell with it, I'm not doing this anymore. And again, privately held business, it was his business. So he could do that. He could just close it if he wanted. And, maybe they got a few people still on the payroll that are handling a couple of little event promotion things that they do or co-branding some stuff. But, it looks like NOPI as we know it no longer exists. Certainly the way I remember it as a parts company dating back to 1966, with brick and mortar stores and selling parts for imports and compact cars. And then their later life as a event promotion company seems to have come to an end as well. And I'm curious what's going to happen with this Myrtle Beach Nationals thing, particularly with the coronavirus. And I don't know if South Carolina is going to shut down or if they're going to ban large gatherings. And I know they're saying, well, it's outdoors and it's a racetrack. There's plenty of space for people to be apart from one another. We'll see what happens. But at any rate, I think I've talked enough. This was really meant to just be a short primer on NOPI, and it ran on way longer than it should have. But I'm going to edit it down, of course. Yeah, so this is NOPI, and this is the little primer for the background, and then I'll start posting the actual events, not in chronological order, but I'll post them as I get around to them, because I have more footage and better footage from some than others, so those will probably be the ones I post first. Thank you for watching Cocktails and Crankshafts. If you enjoy my content, please like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to hit the bell icon, and we'll see you soon with new content.